You are listening to The Darker Sides of Life, a podcast by Hexekami. Hi, and welcome to a new episode of The Darker Sides of Life. I'm your host, Camilla, or perhaps you know me better as hexekami, which is my Instagram handle. And today, I'm talking about the rather strange phenomenon of yearning for what could have been. Before I do that though, I want to mention my Ko-fi page. Did you know that you can support this podcast with a few dollars? It would truly mean a lot to me if you would consider donating. I enjoy making this podcast very much, and from what you tell me when you reach out to me, you are enjoying it too. But making a podcast takes time, and time is money. I do not earn anything from my Instagram at all, and neither do I by making this podcast. So that's why I created the Ko-fi. Another way you can support me and the podcast is by sharing it with your friends and community. I hope to do a second season, but if I am to do that, I need some financial help. So again, I have a Ko-fi. You can find it on the Ko-fi website and search for The Darker Sides of Life. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can always reach me via mail, which is TheDarkerSidesOfLife@gmail.com, or via Instagram @hexekami, or of course, you can post directly on the Ko-fi page, which is also @TheDarkerSidesOfLife. Links are in the description. Now, let's get back to the episode. This one is not going to revolve around a specific memory or incident from my life, since I think the very core meaning of yearning is super abstract. So I will look at the concept of yearning for what could have been from different angles, so we hopefully together can try and understand ourselves more when we yearn for something. And I want to link this feeling with how and why I think yearning is a fundamental tool you can use when and if you are grieving. If you've listened to previous episodes, you know I enjoy establishing a shared understanding of the topic I'm discussing, so we are sure we both know what I'm talking about. So let me begin by doing exactly that. Let us see what the concept of yearning is if we ask a dictionary. Here is what the Oxford Languages have to say on the matter. As always, I will leave all source material for this episode in the description box. Quote, yearn, verb, have an intense feeling of longing for something, typically something that one has lost or been separated from. Archaic, be filled with compassion or warm feeling. End quote. The Cambridge Dictionary says this about yearn, quote, to wish very strongly, especially for something that you cannot have or something that is very difficult to have. End quote. And Merriam-Webster says, quote, to long persistently, wistfully, or sadly. End quote. Right. Now, I think it's safe to say we are in agreement as to what yearning is. One might also call it to ache or to long for. I shall continue calling it yearning in this episode, just for the record. I think many of us will think of literature and films when we think of yearning. I know I often associate it with works of authors like Jane Austen because of the almost tragic aspect the word holds. Because yearning is almost in itself a longing for someone or something that cannot be. Now, if we look at that longing in a Jane Austen kind of way, or any other book or film you may think of when you think of yearning, then it's not always discussed or described in a way where the yearning transcends from life to death and back again. It's probably more like one person being hopelessly in love with someone who's maybe already with someone else, or one of those the one that got away characters I often see in romantic comedies made by Hollywood. This kind of yearning holds a lot of pain and emotion too. It's something I think is very human to feel. Just go back to your teenage crush you never got to kiss, or think of the co-worker you always get a bit flustered thinking about, knowing that a relationship will never happen between the two of you. Yearning is this, I think, the mere feeling of wanting something so bad whilst knowing it's not possible, not available, not in reach. And then there's another kind of yearning, the transcendent one, the kind where you are yearning for what could have been. I once read a diary written by someone who had lost their child when the child was around 5 years old, and the yearning in those words were so heavy I could almost feel the weight of the pen as the grieving parent had written them, like the cold touch of their fingers were poking through the pages touching mine whenever I turn the page. That is also a yearning, a longing for the life the child never got to live, a yearning for the life the parent also never got to live, with the child watching them grow up, a yearning for the identity the parent had being the parent to their child, the longing for what could have been. I also think one can yearn for something within oneself. In last week's episode, I talked about losing myself, how we as humans are all very capable of losing ourselves if something happens to us that we cannot handle. Then we can shut down. And in moments and situations like that, I think the feeling of yearn is a very real one. That the thought of knowing that somewhere inside of oneself, there is a self, a core, an identity, and that whilst this is going on, there is no way of reaching that core, that center. So one is reduced to just being aware of the fact that this core is there, whilst also being completely frozen, like a mental version of the thing Han Solo is put in by Jabba the Hutt, if you get this reference. It may sound as if I'm describing being depressed, which is not my point and not what I'm trying to do. I think yearning, for me, is not necessarily something that will take over like depression does. To me, yearning is more a fleeting state of mind that can vary in length and depth, but that is something that won't suffocate you, like a depression can. I hope that makes sense. Now, can one yearn for inanimate things? I think yes. And I think this part of yearning is what makes it a good tool to have and acknowledge in one's toolbox when it comes to grieving and going through rough patches, because yearning can, in my opinion, just like the creature of sorrow and death, as I've mentioned before, carry and hold memories we wouldn't otherwise remember. Let me give you an example. When it's summer here in Denmark, and it has been raining in that very specific summer rain kind of rain all day, and the streets are wet, and the soil is soaked, and the sun is trying to dry it all up before she goes to bed, and is replaced by the moon, that is when I can out of nowhere get a strong sensation of yearn. I'm not aware of this until it happens, but under the right circumstances, my brain will turn on these memories that I now cannot even properly describe, because I'm not in that very specific environment. It is as if the smell of rain and the sunshine and the wet gardens, they take me back to this time of my life where I have done things with people I love. I yearn for this love when I smell this. The warmth, the memories those specific summer days hold that I can only access when they, the summer days, are there. I cannot artificially induce them right now for you. They are there and not in me, whilst, of course, being in me. They are the longing kind of memory, the longing for something lost that cannot be replaced or reproduced, and they fill me with comfort and peace. The yearn can also come to me if I am scrolling randomly online, just, diving into an odd rabbit hole I don't know where leads to, and I all of a sudden see a picture of something I recognize from my childhood. It can be a toy I had when I was young that I had forgotten about, or a meal, a chair that stood in my childhood home, objects and things that I know deep down exist, but that my mind doesn't go to when I think of memories and remember my life. As if the memory of whatever I remember is, like the rainy summer day, bottled into that very thing, and I can only access it if I look at the thing. I wonder if you have these experiences too, of memories being stored outside of you, like this. Do you recognize this as yearning, or do you call it something else? I mentioned that I think yearning is a good tool to have when dealing with grief and sorrow, and the reason for that is that I believe remembering is how we can connect to not only ourselves, but also to our loved ones that we may have lost. I very strongly believe that coping with loss and mourning is fundamental for one's mental health, and healthy ways to do so can lie in the yearning emotions, because these do not, again in my opinion, lead to downfalls mentally, like for example a depression can. And since the yearn can be stored somewhere else than in ourselves, like with the objects I just mentioned, they can be a choice for us to feel once we've discovered which items may hold our yearn. For me, items that I know will induce this particular feeling are books my grandma had that I now own. If I need that hit of yearn, I go to my basement and look at her books. I flip the pages, I smell them, touch their covers, And then I'm transported right back to a time in my life where love is present and I feel safe and taken care of. I know that specific food will also do this to me, so I can, for example, cook something because I know that doing so and eating this specific dish will give me the same sensation. And I think that when one is mourning, it's very important to also feel joy and love coming from the people or person one is missing and needing so very, very much. People often ask me what they can do about their grief. How can they remember their loved ones and honor them in a good and healthy way that won't make them so sad that they can't be present in their lives now? I think they ask me all of this because I am like an ambassador for death and grief. I don't mean this in any negative way. I take great pride in this, and I hope this podcast in general shows this aspect of me in a clear way. I'm happy to share my experience if it can help other people. That gives me a meaning for all the loss I've dealt with. And when people ask me these things, I often advise them to find their places of yearn. So maybe that is keeping the shirt you have from your father who passed and putting it in an airtight bag so its scent won't fade as fast. Then when you need the love from him in a very concrete matter, you can sniff the shirt. Now this will make you sad, of course, but it will also, hopefully, give you access to the feelings of love and security you felt when he was alive. It could also be that you keep tickets to a show you and your brother went to once where you had a great time. You could frame them, hang them up, or you could keep them in a binder where they will be kept safe. You can tell your family that these things are sacred to you and that they have to ask you before moving them, for example. That way, you know your thing of yearning will be least likely to disappear or break. I also say to people who ask me how to deal with loss that creating a time that fits you and your need, especially for yearning, is a good investment. When I had just lost my grandma and everything was dark and difficult, I started doing these yearning sessions, if we can call them that, where I would deliberately provoke my memory to remember by doing stuff that would induce the yearn. So for me, that is looking at the books I mentioned, cooking food she cooked, but it could also be much more passive things, such as, for example, listening to songs she liked, or that reminded me of her. Or it could be watching a movie I'd seen with her. Because grief is organic, as I've mentioned, and I think it's so important to fit the yearn into the current state of grief one is experiencing. By not listening to oneself, I think it's easy to overstep and get the opposite outcome than desired, which is obviously not what anyone wants in an already difficult and fragile situation. So to summarize, what is yearning and what is it good for? Yearning is a state of longing for something that is lost. It can be ourselves, a loved one, a time of our life, a specific day when we felt joy. If sought out like I have described, I have experienced myself how yearning is a great way to get a break from the sadness that naturally comes when one is mourning. It's almost like giving oneself a hug from the past and telling yourself that things are difficult, but they won't be as difficult as they are right now, forever. Yearning can be a conscious choice and act that can be used to heal from loss. At least it has been for me, and I still use it to this day if I need it. I would love to hear your thoughts on this matter. Do you yearn? And if so, how do you do it? If you want to share with me, then you can send me an email at TheDarkerSidesOfLife@gmail.com, or you can reach me via Instagram at hexekami. There is also the community feed on my Ko-fi, where you can comment on the episodes and podcast in general, and also, of course, support me with a few bucks to help me continue doing audio work like this podcast. I want to mention that, of course, donations are only if you want, and you are always welcome to comment and talk with me, even if you do not support me financially. I want to end this episode with a song lyric that, to me, has some of the abstractness that yearning is. It's a Danish song, and I will read you the first verse from it, and then translate it to you. Now, why am I reading it in Danish and not just translating it? That's because I feel like languages hold a lot of truth, and so I have to speak the words in Danish, knowing that translating them in itself will never mean and show their original intention. So here we go. I hope you enjoy it. Jeg drømmer om en sang, ligesom barndommens somre uden regnvejr og torden, hvor himlen den er klar, og hvor alt det, der førhen var galt, er i orden. Hvor farverne harmonerer med tapetet og matcher med slipset og skjorten. Jeg drømmer om en sang, helt uden dig. Jeg drømmer om en sang, der lige på og hårdt, gennem røgen fra tobakken, der tydelig som en blotter i parken med pointen parat under frakken. Jeg drømmer om en sang, som et vristspark i skridtet og et whiplash i nakken. En sang, der er skrevet uden at tænke på dig. And here it is in English. I'm dreaming of a song that is like my childhood summers without rain and thunder, where the sky is clear and where all that was not right is indeed okay. Where the colors match the colors of the walls and match the tie and the shirt. I'm dreaming of a song completely without you. I'm dreaming of a song that cuts right through the smoke from the tobacco, that is just as clear as an exhibitionist and what he has under his coat. I'm dreaming of a song that is like a kick to the groin and a whiplash in the neck. A song that is written without thinking about you. And that, my friend, is where I will leave you today. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are never alone in the darker sides of life. If you like this episode, I truly appreciate it if you would take a moment to share it with your friends. It helps me reach more people, and the only thing I want is to reach those who need someone to tell them that they are not alone in the darker sides of life. Thank you for helping me and this podcast get out there. And again, I would really appreciate it if you would consider donating via Ko-fi. Links are, as I said, in the description. Bye. You've been listening to The Darker Sides of Life, a podcast by Hexekami.